Good afternoon, and I appreciate you coming out on a weekday like this. So if you looked at the flyer, it lists me as a citizens' rights researcher. What is that? Well, I made it up. I'm a plain language reader of the law and related materials to reach common sense conclusions. These are my opinions and will hopefully inspire others to do similar research and decide for themselves. Now, to a lot of people, when they see something like it's time for Inslee to resign or that he has done criminal offenses and such, that might seem over the top or outrageous. I think by the time I'm done, you're going to understand that's not out of line at all. So my disclaimers are, if I get excited and say lies or liar, I mean allegedly misrepresent. I'm not a doctor. Nothing I say should be considered medical advice. I'm not a lawyer. Nothing should be considered legal advice, but I'm also not stupid. I hope to communicate several ideas that you may want to research on your own. Number one, is it an emergency proclamation or risk of an emergency proclamation? Number two, what does constitutionally compliant infection mitigation look like? Number three, in 2006, the federal government tasked all states to create a pandemic flu plan, which Washington researched and approved in 2007. Why did Washington discard this plan? Number four, was there a better way to do a shutdown? And five, what was the state trying to do instead of that 2000 plan, and whose idea was that? Now, legislation to put time limits on emergencies is floundering, but we should not need any legislation. I think that the missing piece is not legislative, but judicial. Does anyone believe that the original legislative intent of the emergency proclamation was to permit an open-ended, zero oversight, 975-day emergency? Does anyone believe that the representatives who created the emergency statute could ever have imagined a governor maintaining a state of emergency for over 2.5 years? The reason the statute does not have defined time limits is because when used legally for the statutorily defined triggers for real emergencies, the start and stop points are self-evident. The statute 43.610 reads, the governor may, after finding that a public disorder, disaster, energy emergency, or riot exists within this state or any part thereof which affects life, health, property, or the public peace, proclaim a state of emergency in the area affected, and the powers granted the governor during that state of emergency shall be effective only within the area described in the proclamation. Note that epidemic, infection, and pandemic are not listed. This is not a mistake or an oversight, which I will explain in a minute. Energy emergency was added in the 70s. I'll explain that also. The legislative intent is clear from the original three triggers that to issue an emergency proclamation, there must be physical disorder by way of disaster, earthquake, fire, flood, tsunami, volcano, or public disorder or riot. There are no time limits because these are discrete physical events with a clear-cut initiation and cessation. Energy emergency is the only non-physical emergency without a clear-cut start and stop, and it has substantial governance and time limits built in. Expires automatically every 30 days. This was added to the emergency statute by then governors Dan Evans or Dixie Lee Ray in the 70s during the oil embargoes, so the state could have authority to direct odd even gas purchases. If you're not old enough, during the 70s there were times when if your license plate last number was even, you could only buy gas on a calendar even day and also on an odd day. Now, why did they have to do this, add that to the law? Because as dumb as it sounds, it violates the Constitution to tell a citizen with a license plate ending in an odd number that he can't buy gas on an even day. If something as minor as that required protective legislation to be constitutional, then imagine how egregious the constitutional violations have been during the COVID shutdown fiasco. Neither of those governors tried to use the disaster designation. Now, 4306-220 details the procedure for declaring and then suspending a state of emergency. Included is the directive language, all capitals, provided the governor must terminate said state of emergency when order is restored in the affected area. My contention is that conditions in Washington never met the level required to declare an emergency. My first proof of this is in the original proclamation. It does not list the disorder that requires the emergency proclamation. Instead, the proclamation references a CDC-designated threat and then risk 4 or 5 times and then declares a disaster. How many times in the press conferences did Governor Inslee say, "We are not in trouble now, but the model says if we don't do A, B, and C, we will be in trouble"? How many COVID patients were treated in the emergency hospital set up in Seattle CenturyLink Field? 0. In September of 2021, 17 months after the hospital was torn down and 13 months before ending the emergency, Governor Inslee was interviewed on TVW and asked, "What is the criteria for ending the emergency?" The governor replied, I'm paraphrasing, "There is no criteria. I will know when it is time." Now, logically, if there is no criteria to exit the emergency, there's no criteria to be in the emergency. Now, Governor Inslee confirmed there was no criteria for ending the emergency by selecting a calendar day, Halloween 2022, instead of a set of conditions like case or mortality rates. I did hear a defense for the extended emergency was because it allowed access to emergency funding. I would be much more sympathetic to that argument if the emergency money was being directed at the business owners and others whose lives were upended with ridiculous pandemic mitigation, but that money just went into the black hole, and those people whose businesses were destroyed are still not compensated. There are people who don't understand the significance of what has happened and even think this isn't that bad. The governor should be able to do what he wants when he needs to without having to declare an emergency. What's the big deal? These people are usually government or big corporation employees who weren't impacted and maintained paychecks, etc. What is the purpose of an emergency law? To temporarily allow in limited area the violation of constitutional rights. To tell people you can't go into that area after an earthquake to prevent looting. Restricting it. Ordering churches closed is a violation of the First Amendment, and it's insulting when liquor stores and pot shops are left open. Prohibiting citizens from being able to assemble and petition the government for redress by protesting the pandemic rules is a violation of the First Amendment, and it's insulting when protests for social justice are permitted. Closing businesses and prohibiting citizen use of their private property in legal commerce is a First and Fifth Amendment violation, and permitting other businesses to remain open is a 14th Amendment violation. Involuntary quarantines without due process are illegal detentions under the law. We have 2 big problems here. The first is permitting this administration to expand and redefine without legislative input the term disaster to include whatever the administration wants it to include. The second is that it doesn't even have to be a real emergency, but only something the administration thinks might be a risk of a future emergency. Does anyone think the state should have the power to violate the Constitution because something might happen?
No.
Is it the risk, is it the emergency rule, or the risk of emergency? The precedent has been set now that anything the administration feels as a risk could be declared an emergency proclamation and constitutional rights violated. But it was a novel pandemic. We had to do something. Whatever is done must fit within the Constitution. Instead of this fiasco, the state should have used existing statute. Washington has extensive constitutionally compliant guidance in Washington Administrative Code 246-100, not coincidentally titled Communicable and Certain Other Diseases. This got us through the Spanish flu, typhoid, the Hong Kong flu, Marburg, everything else. This WAC details the proper legal infection management within constitutional constraints. First, all health department interventions are voluntary recommendations unless certain conditions are followed. Restricting the movements of healthy people is a quarantine, and if ordered involuntarily with threat of punishment becomes a detention. Part of preventing illegal detentions are Miranda rights. In criminal proceedings, citizens have the presumption of innocence. In medical proceedings, citizens have the presumption of health. Citizens cannot be involuntarily detained without due process. A legal involuntary quarantine cannot exceed 10 days, and the quarantined person or group must be presented this notice. You have the right to petition the Superior Court for release from isolation or quarantine in accordance with WAC 246-100-55. You have the right to legal counsel. If you are unable to afford legal counsel, then counsel will be appointed for you at government expense, and you should request the appointment of counsel at this time If you currently have legal counsel, then you have an opportunity to contact that counsel for assistance. This is the medical Miranda rights all citizens have when faced with involuntary medical quarantines. I was not given that notice. Were you? To go beyond the 10 days required is another court appearance to extend that, and in no case can it exceed 30 days. Worst case scenario, none of this should have persisted beyond a month. So what we have experienced is lawless behavior by this administration. They violated the Constitution, federal and state. They've violated RCW and WAC. What about the judiciary? Why can't we get relief there? Let me spend a couple of minutes on that. How often do you see an incumbent judge challenged in an election? Not often. How often is an incumbent judge defeated in an election? Not often. How often does a judge decide to leave the bench in close enough proximity to an election for new candidates to run as equals for the open seat? Not often. When a judge leaves the bench off cycle, how are they replaced? Governor appointment with no legislative input or approval. They don't provide a list of possible candidates, nor do they confirm. And when the next election cycle comes around, that appointed person now runs at the incumbent, and we're back at square A again. Imagine the result of a multi-term governor. I just heard a report from the Washington Policy Center that 3 superior judges who approved this excise tax recently ran unopposed. What happened to the 2007 pandemic plan? The administration discarded it. That plan was researched, thought through, and resourced. It did not have any business closures or other stay-at-home shelter-in-place provisions. What was the governor's plan? We'll designate some businesses essential and let them operate, and deem others non-essential and shut them down. What will they do for money? They can go on unemployment. How did that work out? Thousands of small business failures, tens of thousands of citizens went months without benefits, widespread havoc and destruction. In 2021, the Department of Revenue said over 2,900 restaurants had permanently closed. Each of those potentially represents a shattered family and the destruction of generational wealth. A restaurant that is open is worth some multiple of its gross or profits. A family may have planned to sell it to fund a retirement or to be an inheritance. A restaurant that is closed has no value except for cents on the dollar of its fixtures, tables, chairs, ovens, etc. Imagine that business of closing. You can be open 50% closed, take a week off, all of your inventory goes bad in the freezer. It's ridiculous. Oh, you can open for takeout only. The closest restaurant to me is a Benihana style Japanese place. You're going to have the people roll their window down that much and try to flip a shrimp in through that opening? Now, I just found out that there's now a Washington Hospitality Grants Program that opened March 14th. Requirements are that you must have been open by April 20 and took a 25% hit or more and are not closing this year. Does anybody see the problem with this? What if you were open in 2020, suffered 100% loss, and had to close? And then you lost your cars or pulled your kids from college or you lost your house. How does somebody like that apply? I didn't find that on the website. Now, was this outcome unpredictable? Was this a good plan that just didn't go well? Absolutely not. This was never workable. Unemployment is for employees. The administration asked them to change the benefit structure so the self-employed and business owners could apply. That change alone would take months. Under normal conditions, it was attempted in less than a week. Where are the notes and minutes of the meetings when someone asks unemployment? How long is this going to take? Agencies are sourced to their historical demand. Unemployment processes 6,500 to 7,000 applications per week. Did somebody ask them, what's going to happen if we bury you under 100 times your normal load at a time when no in-person applications and all the other COVID medications are allowed? What did the administration would think would happen? They shoved 700,000 people into a system that was designed for 7,000 a week. But we had to do something. Explain this to your lockdown-loving friends and watch the blood drain from their face when they realize how simple and effective the smart stay-at-home plan would have been. Every business in the state regularly submits financial information, including detailed payroll reports. Why wasn't this functioning, existent payment distribution system utilized? Business owners should have been notified. There's a health emergency that requires you to suspend operations for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. Based on your historical payroll reports, we're transferring funds to you to disperse to your employees for this time period to permit them to stay safe at home. Please contact us if there's been any changes. Due to this unprecedented situation, we're also going to support all business owners, independent contractors, and other self-employed with a salary or draw. To prevent other disruptions to your business and the overall economy, we will be providing support to cover the non-consumable fixed expenses associated with your business. Please continue to pay your rent, lease, mortgage, and other overhead because those represent revenue to others. The state is creating a claims program for perishable inventory, income reduction, and other closure-related losses. Please document losses as thoroughly as possible and look for future communications detailing the compensation process. We apologize for the disruption and appreciate your cooperation because we are all in this together. No delays, no fraud, no business failures. To not do that is incompetence. The first part I'm talking about is illegal. The next part is incompetence. Failure to do what I just described should be criminal. Since they abandoned the 2007 plan, what exactly was the administration trying to do? Remember how ridiculous so much of the guidance was. Why were obviously safe activities outside like hiking, golfing, fishing, boating banned? Why were facilities with huge air volumes forced to close, bowling alleys? What were the criteria for businesses to be essential and non-essential instead of safe and unsafe? Every business is essential to its owner. If it's safe to operate, who cares? What was the administration trying to do, and who thought up the plan? We obtained public record request emails between the governor's office and various Gates Foundation affiliates, University of Washington, Microsoft, etc. We asked for copies of the contracts between the state and these groups. There were none because these groups were simply volunteering their time out of the goodness of their heart. No contracts mean no governance. Here's an email on March 19th, 2020 between the foundation, a group called Infectious Disease Modeling, and the Washington Department of Health. Niket and I just had a great conversation with Kathy from Washington Department of Health. The governor's office is interested in learning the potential impact of their policy measures on reducing population movements around the state. Potential impact. The purpose of this effort is to learn which of the social distancing trajectories we previously modeled might be most realistic, 25, 50, 75%. Of course, we will ultimately need case data, which is delayed due to disease dynamics and reports, to determine the true impact of these policies on COVID-19 incidents. Any thoughts or insights you might be able to share on the Facebook data would be much appreciated. The reply the next day: Dear Kathy, we've worked quickly to prepare a report describing our findings based on population occupancy and mobility data. The conclusion is, as we previously discussed, it's too soon to determine the impact of the policy changes on reductions in COVID-19 cases and deaths. However, the results are quite interesting. We see significant changes in population mobility. Here are key messages. It's still too soon to see impact of the cases and deaths due to inherent delays in COVID-19. However, we see changes in occupancy and mobility patterns. This is very disturbing. The administration failed to use the proven 2007 pandemic plan for a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation experimental model, making population mobility reduction a surrogate target for infection control. The language in this email makes it clear that they did not know if the mitigations would result in reduced population mobility, and two, if it did reduce population mobility, if that would reduce COVID cases or not. The administration imposed actions with known harms and catastrophic outcomes on the citizenry, trying to test two levels of uncertainty. It's like a double inception. The entire Washington state population was forced into an experiment without information or consent. This is why obviously safe activities were closed, not to meet any infection reduction criteria, but to try to have cell phones ping in less places to show that the population mobility reduced. People's businesses and lives were destroyed because the administration outsourced the COVID response to unaccountable private parties that happen to be the governor's most prolific donors and supporters. It's a very bad look. In the immediate shock of COVID and media circus and disbelief that actions this destruction and unfair on the citizens became none. Now that there is some time to get past this, I'm hoping there's some clarity, and I truly hope that there can be accountability for this damage. Thank you very much.